lot of my social circles in Istanbul at the time were British and American folks who were doing everything they could to create and extend the Syrian civil war.
Welcome to the More Freedom Foundation podcast, answering the difficult questions, Robert Morris, and asking the stupid questions, Rory McElhone.
Hello, Rory. How's it going?
I've had better weeks. I was to do a bit of extras work for Derry City, but it fell through because I forgot to book the day off, which made me look very silly. How are you getting on?
It must be frustrating. No real complaints. It's raining and miserable here in New York City, but it's also quite warm, quite unseasonably warm. So
it's humid as well.
Yeah. It's a humid day in December in New York, which is something that we've become used to in our modern day and age. But it's all right.
I was just looking up that on the world's most expensive cities to live in the world, New York came number one.
Oh man, we're the big winner again, huh? I thought for a period of time there, San Francisco was beating us out, but I guess the tech crunch is on. The tech deflation. So New York's number one again. Huh?
Yes, it's number one. But you know what's at the bottom of the expensive cities index?
I do not know.
A little city called Damascus.
Ah, wow. Damascus, Syria, yes. Which is an extraordinary segue on your part, Rory, because today that's what I want to talk about. I want to talk about Syria and Turkey.
Which also has another wonderful city that spans two continents.
It does. Istanbul, Turkey, where I lived for 6 years and actually got to watch the Syrian civil war get started, launch, and see its effects on Turkey and much more impactfully Turkey's influence on the Syrian
What's
civil
interesting
war.
is that you would have been, Istanbul's at the other end of the country compared to the Syrian border. So it felt like if things are impacting there, they must be impacting the rest of the country in a much more dramatic fashion.
Oh, no question. Certainly at its more hectic periods, the Syrian civil war sort of transformed a lot of cities on the border. I think, is it Gaziantep, Şanlıurfa? Gaziantep in particular, I believe, or unless I'm mixing it up, was transformed. Became in some ways almost a Syrian city with the number of refugees that were there. But Istanbul, of course, is the largest city in Istanbul by far, and it's in a country that is very top-down in its organization. So Istanbul's something like a fifth to a quarter of Turkey's population. So it became a destination for Syrian refugees as well. So the city was absolutely transformed. It's also not technically the political center of Turkey. That's Ankara, the capital, but it became a natural stomping ground for a lot of the people that were organizing and carrying out the Syrian rebellion, the Syrian civil war, what have you. A lot of my social circles in Istanbul at the time were British and American folks who were doing everything they could to create and extend the Syrian civil war. So I think I've got more than a bit of perspective on this conflict.
There's probably some war reporters that you have more on the ground experience of this conflict who let on their experts on the Syrian conflict.
Oh, absolutely. And most of those folks, when they weren't in Syria, were based in Istanbul. One of the interesting aspects of the Syrian civil war, which has allowed it to become even more than other conflicts in history, has been the extreme hostility of the folks that are supposedly on our side towards Western journalists. So while Western journalists could continue to go to territories that Assad controlled throughout the conflict, within a year or two of the conflict's beginning, they simply could not go to rebel-controlled territories, which made it a lot easier for outside powers to control the narrative of what was going on in those areas, because Western journalists were simply, if they went to rebel controlled territories, they'd be kidnapped, sold, and possibly end up on a videotape of their execution. So I think a lot of the Syrian conflict was kind of a black box. And adding to that complexity is the fact that almost every regional actor was seriously involved, as well as the United States, as well as Russia, as well as a number of NATO countries that tried to have a hand in, thinking specifically of the French and the British. So it's just this kaleidoscope of complexity and horror. So it can be kind of hard to draw strands out. But I think that's what we're going to try to do today, because I think the most important thing that's happening in Syria right now, probably not the most damaging thing or the most significant thing, but the most important for sort of the world political scene right now, is Turkey's ongoing threats to take more Syrian territory.
But they're going to give it back, Rob, just once there's a peace deal signed.
That's a very good point. That's a distinction between what Turkey is doing in Syria and what, say, Russia is doing in Ukraine. The Turkish government, even the hyper-nationalist folks that are in power, the Turkish government has always claimed that they're just doing this for the safety of the Syrian people, and that they're sure to give it back as soon as there's some kind of peace deal. What's an interesting thing about the Syrian civil war is that it was largely over and done with. The serious fighting was largely concluded in 2017 or so, when the United States, Russia, and Syria, interestingly, teamed up to defeat the Islamic State, and Iran as well teamed up to defeat the Islamic State. So the conflict has been largely over since 2017, 2018 or so, but we've still, 4 years after that, have no kind of deal, because the United States, Western powers more generally, are unwilling to concede the obvious fact that Assad has won this civil war. So as long as that status of the conflict continues, as long as the United States and Europe refuse to concede the fact that their side lost, there's never going to be a peace deal. And it's just going to keep limping on. And Turkey is just going to keep holding on to territory, no matter how high-minded they claim their reasons for holding that territory are.
But at least Turkey's behavior you can somewhat justify, as this is a conflict on their border, while the British, the French, the Russians, and the Americans, it's quite a distance for them. Do you think there's at least some understanding of why Turkey's heavily involved?
I think that's a great point, and I think that's something that should be emphasized. There's a great school of criticism against Turkey's actions in this conflict, and to be clear, I think that Turkey has made horrific mistakes in this conflict. I think the horrific mistake that they made was to get involved in the first place. They allowed the United States to sort of sell them a bill of goods in 2011, 2012. Erdogan turned on Assad, the dictator of Syria that he had previously been very friendly to, and sort of got on, team get Assad with the United States, and ended up, again, because Turkey is located there, on the border, shares a massive border with Syria, ended up being one of the prime actors in trying to unseat Assad, set up a new government for Syria. What then happened, which I do believe is a betrayal, quite frankly, is that the United States government decided to start working with the Kurds in Syria. Now, there are many different varieties of Kurdish factions and political parties in the Middle East, across Syria, Iraq, Iran, and Turkey, all countries that have serious Kurdish populations. The group in particular that the United States chose to cozy up to in northern Syria is a group that can fairly be construed as heroic, doing amazing things, standing up to the Islamic State. But the direct connections, and these aren't assertions by Turkey. These aren't terrible conspiracy theories that the Turks are putting forward, there is a direct connection between the Kurdish militias the United States has been arming and supporting for the past 5 years in northern Syria, a direct connection between those Kurdish groups and the PKK, a internationally acknowledged terrorist group that has killed something along the lines of 30 to 40,000 people. I mean, to be clear, the Turkish government has killed a lot of those people too, but conflicts related to the PKK have killed 30 to 40,000 people over the past 30 years.
How close would the PKK be to the Turkish government?
Well, how close would they be? I mean, they've been incredibly antagonistic for quite some time. There was a great period, sort of Erdogan's early time in power. Honestly, Erdogan's first decade, and I'd have to go back and look at this. I don't know whether there was actually direct negotiations with the PKK, but there were movements towards that. Erdogan was more amenable towards peace with this official terrorist organization than prior people had been, until Erdogan lost an election in 2015, decided he needed to get the nationalists on board, and now he's as vehemently anti-Kurdish, or certainly as vehemently anti-PKK as anybody before him. So the PKK is, I mean, and this is, to be clear, this is a U.S. acknowledged terrorist group. This is, I think most European countries also acknowledge the PKK to be a terrorist group. So it is a pretty immense and shocking betrayal that the U.S. government issued to Turkey. 2011 to 2014 or so, the joint U.S.-Turkish policy is let's go in and support all these jihadists to overtake Assad. And then one of those jihadist groups, the Islamic State, gets out of control in the United States. I think quite rationally at that point, we never should have been supporting jihadists in Syria in the first place, but quite rationally at that point is like, oh, wow, we got to get this terrible Islamic State group. And in order to do it, we're gonna cozy up with the Kurds, who prior to this have actually been mostly on Assad's side. And the Turkish government is like, wait, what? And I think it's entirely correct and justified for the Turkish government to be outraged by what has happened. Now, does that mean that the Turkish government is justified in taking the actions that it has taken? Specifically, in Afrin, one of the regions that the Turkish government has taken, my understanding is that the Turkish government has engaged in wide-scale ethnic cleansing. And there are a number of serious crimes against humanity that the Turks have justly been accused of, as far as I can tell. So I think, on the one hand, it's very important to acknowledge that the Turkish government was absolutely screwed by the United States. And if Turkey had any leadership that was capable of expressing itself in a reasonable manner rather than sort of, Erdogan's typical antics, I think that the Turkish government's right to some kind of redress would be more widely acknowledged. So you got to acknowledge that, the Turks were screwed, but you've also got the same point. On the other side of that, you've also got to acknowledge that that does not give the Turkish government the right to take the sovereign territory of another country. It does not give them the right to ethnically cleanse that territory, even if there already was ethnic cleansing going on there, in between Syrian factions. It does not give the Turkish government the right to invade and occupy territory. And that's what's been happening since 2016.
What's currently happening? Because when I watch it, there seems to be the odd, bombing or artillery strike from Turkey into Syria. Do you think there'll be an escalation anytime soon? Or is this just a constant drip of this horrendous conflict?
Well, there is a constant level of attacks by the Turkish government on both Iraq and Syria. Iraq and Syria are just two profoundly sad countries at this point, who've largely lost sovereignty as we understand it. It is, on any given day, it is not out of the ordinary for Syria to be attacked by Turkey or Israel. Both of those countries reserve the right to bomb Syria at any point. It does not make news when it happens. Sometimes, if it's particularly egregious, the Israelis or the Turks, kill too many civilians with one of their attacks, then it'll get a brief notice. But this is an ongoing thing. I think it's important to mention that this is kind of pinprick. Any attack like this, any bombing of another country is an act of war. It is an outrage against the international community, but that is not how it's treated because of the precedent really that the United States has set over the past 20 years. The United States has ongoing military operations going on in at least 7 countries that are acknowledged and probably significantly more. And beyond those 7 countries that we, I think, openly operate in, there are, for reasons of counterterror, we reserve the right to use our secret special forces all over countries in Africa, some in Asia, all over the place, just not acknowledge it, what have you. So Israel and Turkey have taken that justification and run with it. So both the Turkish government, despite the fact that they control serious chunks of territory, more than it might look like on the map. It just looks like a little rim in northern Syria. But I've read accounts that I don't quite trust. But I have read one account recently that maintains there are 4 million Syrians in that territory that the Turks control. So the Turks, even though they control territory with significant Syrian populations, would maintain that no, we're not invading Syria. We're not even really attacking the Syrian government. We're just creating a safe zone. And Israel would also deny. I think there was some interesting story that I don't quite recall, where I think Israel sort of half apologized for one of these attacks because they killed too many Syrian soldiers. To be clear, they often kill Syrian soldiers, but they killed a few too many this time. They're like, oh no, just want to tell the Syrian government, no, we weren't.
We went beyond the quota.
Yeah, we weren't intending to attack the Syrian government. We're just attacking your Iranian allies that have been invaluable in the survival of your government. And Iraq is in this situation to an extent as well, with Turkey and Iran both sort of reserving the right to attack Iraqi territory. So this is something that is worth focusing on and not passing over, because any other country in the world would see the kind of run-of-the-mill pinprick actions that Turkey, Iran, and Israel and the United States take in Iraq and Syria as an act of war, as the beginning of an outright, full-on conflict.
Does Syria only have 2 friendly neighbours in the form of Jordan and Libya? Because from what you're saying, everyone else is taking potshots at them.
Well, the Jordanians actually had a big part in the conflict in the beginning as well, and helped to set up what I think was largely seen as more stable and less frightening and jihadist rebel groups in the south of the country. So Jordan played an important role in that as well. What was kind of interesting, though, is that, this is 3 or 4 years ago at this point, is that those groups, well, I guess probably because they were more rational and could see how things were going and were less insane than the groups in the north, pretty much very, very quickly capitulated to Assad over the course of a couple months. I can't recall the year exactly, but it's at least 3 or 4 years ago at this point. But yes, the Jordanians definitely had a hand in the civil war before. And I guess Lebanon has definitely been heavily, heavily involved as well. In fact, the Lebanese militia Hezbollah has been one of the main supports of the Syrian government throughout the conflict. So Lebanon, depending on what you think of the legitimacy of the Syrian government, Lebanese factions, Hezbollah, have either been a key part in ending this civil war and keeping the somewhat legitimate government in power, or they are dastardly folks who kept the murderous Assad dictator in power. So really, to answer your question, Ray, every neighbor was involved, heavily involved. And now we're at a point, which is interesting, just how this has evolved. Now, most of the Arab world, I think, has belatedly realized that creating this nightmare has been terrible for Arabs in general, and has allowed both the Iranians and the Turks, historical imperial masters of Arabs, has allowed both of those countries to take serious Arab lands, given them much more power, and just made the Arab world in general weaker and more put upon. So it seems like most Arabs are coming around to the idea that, okay, it's time to give up and concede that Assad has won here, but they can't actually do that until the United States allows that to happen. The United States currently maintains some of the strongest sanctions that we maintain anywhere in the world, making sure that Syria can't rebuild. So it's really Turkey that is the main actor from the anti-Assad coalition that's still working at it really hard. I mean, it's clear the United States has got, maybe 1,000 U.S. troops fumbling around in the desert, making sure, sort of acting as a block on reconstruction or any progress in Syria. But I don't think they're currently working too hard for the overthrow of Assad.
Were these the same sort of troops that were removed by Trump so Turkey could attack the Kurds?
Well, the key thing about Trump's removal of U.S. troops from Syria, it happened about 3 times, supposedly. He announced on 3 separate occasions during his 4 years in power, Donald Trump announced very loudly, very proudly, I'm taking U.S. troops out of Syria. There's no reason for them to be there. The Islamic State has been defeated. Every time he said that, he was entirely correct. He absolutely was right there. And every time he did that, I ran a video saying so. I am not a fan of Donald Trump. Donald Trump is not somebody I wanted to be president. I think he was an absolute catastrophe. However, he was absolutely right on Syria. One indication of what a catastrophe he was that he was utterly incapable of making the military follow his orders. Because despite the fact that he announced the withdrawal of U.S. troops from Syria on 3 occasions, they're still there. What did happen in, I believe it was 2019, is he did withdraw U.S. troops from some contested areas in the north. And that is significant because Manbij, Tel Rifat, not sure if U.S. troops were in Tel Rifat, but they certainly were in Manbij, are exactly the territories that the Turkish president Erdogan is threatening today. He is threatening to take. So while Trump did withdraw U.S. troops from the sort of line of fire there between the Kurds and the Turks, which I do believe is a good thing, Donald Trump failed to actually get U.S. troops out of Syria. Our troops are still there. It's interesting because they are widely ineffectual.
Do you think Trump was easy to manipulate by the military? I'm purely thinking because you're saying he wanted them out essentially permanently, but they're still there. He was the first, president to talk about a removal of troops from Afghanistan, which seemed to be ignored to the point where some people are calling it treason. And then Biden comes in and does the same thing, but yet the military listened on that occasion. Do you think he was easier to manipulate?
Oh, incredibly easy to manipulate. And you have folks in the Trump administration, specifically, was it Ambassador Jeffries? What's his name? I can't remember if he was an ambassador, but there's a guy, I think something Jeffries, who had an interview who's basically like, oh yeah, we lied to Trump, or we just sort of manipulated him. He's just sort of like, yeah, like that clown, yeah. We were going to stay in Syria and no matter what Trump wanted. And yeah, I think that's fair it's fair to describe that as treason or mutiny.
Nothing will come of it.
But most people, most Democrats and establishment Republicans in the United States describe that as heroism. It looks to me more like a military coup, but, potato. So, I mean, when you talk about Afghanistan, I think Donald Trump, this is a different episode, but I think Donald Trump and Joe Biden deserve a joint Nobel Peace Prize for getting us out of Afghanistan. I think that nobody other than Donald Trump could have proposed it, and nobody other than Joe Biden could have carried it out. Trump certainly wouldn't have been able to.
Was it something Biden had spoke about under Obama's presidency, but Obama was worried about looking weak on the, U.S. military front?
Well, one thing about Joe Biden, and I maintain that Joe Biden is the best foreign policy president of the 21st century. That doesn't mean he's a good foreign policy president. That just means
it was a low bar.
It's a very low bar. It's a very low bar. But Biden's great virtue when it comes to interactions with the Pentagon, which is something that Yeah, that nobody else really had this century. Obama didn't have it. He was an outsider. He had like one term in the Senate before he was president, or less than a term in the Senate. Bush was a Texas governor, so knew nothing about foreign policy. And obviously, Donald Trump obviously knew absolutely nothing about foreign policy. I'm not sure if he was entirely clear on where Afghanistan was.
I don't think he had a golf course there.
Yeah, if they don't have a golf course, why would he care?
He seemed to have, there was a very good book, The Commander in Cheat, I'd recommend, because quite often when he would give evidence, damning Trump, he'd say, oh, I think he is doing business in Russia because he has a golf course there and an issue, whatever, of Golf Weekly. His son talks about it. So it was nice not to have airy-fairy, like, oh, I heard a man that said something, just going, oh, yeah, just read this golf magazine. But they were saying quite often if he did have a golf course in a country, he was very interested in that country. But yes, if he didn't, then
wow, yeah,
not so
that's
much.
not particularly surprising. But what's great about Biden and makes him different from Trump, Obama, and Bush is that he's actually been in Washington D.C. For God, 60 years at this point. He was on the Senate Foreign Relations.
When the telegram got put in, he was there, wasn't he?
Yeah, he was living there in a shack before George Washington got there. But he is ancient. I think. Yeah, I recall. Yeah, Nixon was president when Biden started
Wow.
in Congress. I'm not sure if he started in the Senate, but yeah, it's extraordinary. So he's interacted with the military. I don't know if he was the chair, but I believe he was on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee for decades, and he was vice president when famously the U.S. military just gave Obama an absolute snow job. Just really conned him into giving them tons more money for a pointless surge in Afghanistan.
A snow job is when you hit someone with a huge amount of meaningless paperwork just to
I don't
distract
know
them,
actually,
essentially.
Rory, but I think that makes sense. It's just a term I've used.
Okay. No, I heard it as a spy. It was like a spy term. If people are after you, you can hit them with just so much useless paperwork, but to them it looks like, oh my God, this is fantastic, and it takes them a huge amount of time to figure out this is all
But
rubbish.
I think that's a fair description of what the Pentagon did to Obama. And even at that point, Biden said this surge looks ridiculous, seems like an entire waste of time and money, and we don't need to do this. And then he came into office about a decade later. Had the generals were selling him the same line of, well, we desperately need to be there. We need to be there forever. It'll all get better next year. And he said no. Because he understood and knew from his personal experience that it was all hogwash. So that is a great virtue of Biden. Unfortunately, that virtue does not yet seem to be applied in Syria, and he has not taken these U.S. soldiers out. But I do think that the U.S. soldiers are kind of intentionally at this point, or unintentionally, but have sort of ended up, because of the weird political machinations around them, have sort of ended up as a sideshow. I think they mostly function to keep things a little less stable, make it a little more likely that the Islamic State can survive to keep getting bombed so lucratively. But they're not really the big show. The big show is, what is Turkey going to do to Syria over the next couple days, months, weeks, or years?
So what would Turkey say next 10 years if it went to plan look like?
Well, that's a really important question. I think that's probably the main question that we should talk about today. It's, if the war, phony war continues, then Turkey can just sort of hold on to that territory indefinitely. It seems, though, that very few actors other than the United States want this phony war to continue. The most hostilities were over in 2017, 2018. The United States still wants to hold on to this idea that, I don't know, like Assad has to negotiate with a bunch of Syrian folks who haven't been in the country for a decade or living in Switzerland or something. We just want to starve the country to death, in the hopes that they'll eventually get rid of Assad. But it seems like most everybody else, certainly Russia and Iran, who've supported Assad from the get-go, but also the entire Arab world, the Arab monarchies that spent so much money with the US and Turkey funding jihadists at the beginning. Everybody seems to want this conflict to end. So we're at this interesting space with Turkey, and Turkey does kind of get to make the decisions here, because the United States is just, has its just sort of baseline of aggression, of ineffectual aggression. that nobody really wants to pay attention to. It's Turkey that makes choices here. So we could see over the next year, probably sadly, most likely result that we'll see over the next year or so, hopefully not for 10 years, is a continuation of this status quo, of just this sort of amorphous thing that just allows Turkey to slowly solidify its control of these northern Syrian regions, but without any, big step one way or the other. It's also possible, we've seen a lot of people talking about the possibility that Turkey, the Erdogan will start talking to Assad in Syria. That last non-US piece of aggression against Assad will fall. They'll start talking. They'll do some sort of deals. The Kurds will have to very, very quickly make peace with Assad. Then the Turks will withdraw. That's a possibility, though I wouldn't expect it to be so straightforward from Turkey and Syria starting to talk to the Turkish withdrawal. I'd expect that to be hemming and hawing. That's one possibility. That's obviously would be the ideal possibility, is Assad and Erdogan talk, Turkey pulls out, war is finally over, U.S. lifts these sanctions, and the rest of the world can finally start rebuilding Syria. That'd be ideal. That's possible, but it's probably not the most likely. I think continuing stagnation is the most likely. What we are getting more and more worried about is the particularly horrific possibility, which is that Turkey goes on to take another couple chunks of northern Syrian territory. That would involve serious conflict, not just between Turkey and the Kurds this time. So far, the Turks have moved in to Syria in, I think, 3 separate moves. You had 2016, the initial move, where I think in 2016, they were actually taking territory from the Islamic State. Then in subsequent moves, the particularly horrific taking of territory in Afrin, historically Kurdish territory that's probably been ethnically cleansed, another move with Trump's famous withdrawal that allowed Turkey to take another chunk of territory. What's interesting is what would be different now if Turkey were to take these places, Manbij and Tel Rifat, that it is threatening to take, is it would actually be going more directly to war against the Syrian government.
So they were just tidying up rebels, essentially, areas that Syrian government didn't really have a control over.
Exactly. And in 2019, the resolution of that Turkish incursion was actually the Kurds saying to the Syrian government that they had been distanced from because of U.S. influence, saying to the Russians, the Kurds, the heroic allies of the United States, the Kurds, said to the Syrians and the Russians, you need to come up here and start patrolling in Manbij and Tel Rifat. So now the Turks maintain that that's only a fiction. There's only a few Syrian government and Russian troops in those areas, and the Kurds are really technically still in control. But regardless, if the Turkish government goes into those areas, there's a very serious chance of more direct conflict between Russians, Syrians, and Turkey. That is a shift. And if that happens, then I believe that a lot of the possibility of that happy result, that finally the war is allowed to end, that we were just talking about, I think that if that happens, if Turkey takes Manbij and Tel Rifat, I think that becomes a lot less possible. Because at that point, now to be clear, there has been direct conflict between the Turkish military and the Syrian military before. I think the Syrian military kind of got over its skis a little bit, killed a bunch of Turkish soldiers, and then the Turkish military, a much, much more serious military.
The Turkish military, I kind of see it as, expenditure-wise and maybe experience similar to Britain, France, Russia, that sort of height. So we are talking, after the big dogs like America and China, Turkey's up there. It is a very modern, capable military, which I think you'd said previously, maybe 10 years ago, they weren't battle hardened, but they've definitely learnt a hell of a lot in the Syrian war. So when they go toe to toe with Syria, they have the advantage.
Exactly. Turkey for a very long time had always had a serious military. Military was very since as long as there's been a Turkish Republic, and of course before that the Ottoman Empire had a serious military history. But as long as there's been a Turkish Republic, there's been a very high investment in the military. The military was too involved in Turkish government for much of a century, but it was a defensive. If you'd asked me 10 years ago, I'd say, oh, well, it's a defensive military. With the exception of Cyprus, they don't really, they want to defend Turkish territories. They're not aggressive or adventurous. And that has changed very seriously over the past decade. In Syria, chiefly, of course, but also in Libya, where and I believe in a very positive way, the Turks put their finger on the scale in that conflict a couple of years ago. They are not quite as big a player as the United States militarily in Africa and the Middle East, but they are getting there. So yeah, it's a very serious military. So there's not any real question of the Turkish military being physically incapable of taking Manbij or Tal Rafat. There will be some Kurds who heroically die to stop them. If the Syrian military will most likely just withdraw and get out of their way. So it's not a question of whether the Turks can physically take this territory. It's a question of whether they can weather the political cost, whether it's worth that. And that calculation, of course, has been changed dramatically this year by Russia's somewhat insane, deeply insane invasion of Ukraine.
The Russian invasion shows us the perils of a full-on invasion, because you can look intimidating and look scary, but it does appear that Russia is now an old man fighting maybe a less experienced younger man. While Turkey seems much more popular, I would say, to this drip, 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 because we don't hear about, occupied territory in Syria, but we do hear about occupied territory in Ukraine. But also you can essentially still keep all your troops, still look scary, and just slowly move forward and take land in a way that doesn't hugely get people's backs up.
Yeah, I think that's exactly what Turkey has been doing. It's been a slow drip, drip, drip. If we continue in this limbo, if the Syrian peace process, such as it is, continues to go nowhere, the Turks can just sort of continue to hold on to that territory. It's an interesting question what's going to happen with the elections that are expected next year. I think within the next 6 months, Erdogan, for the first time in 5 years, is going to have to face the Turkish electorate. What happens if he gets unseated? Are the new guys going to pull the Turkish troops right out? I think a lot of people are expecting that, but I don't know. There's a lot of ifs there.
Or push a few more in?
That would surprise me. I do think that they would start. The one thing that the most important thing for a new Turkish government to establish would be that we are not Erdogan and we are a force for stability. And I think further expanding Turkey's growing empire in Syria would be the opposite of that. But yeah, I just, I don't know. I do think that people associate the Turkish occupation of Syria a bit too much with Erdogan. Obviously, it wouldn't have happened without him. I don't know. I'm not saying it's 100% that 10 years from now, Turkey will still be in Syria, but I'd say it's a solid 40%. I think it's very possible.
What way do they administer these territories? Are the people paying taxes there? Or, what way is Turkey, other than boots on the ground, as they talk about, what way do these places feel Turkish?
Well, they're being administered through the remnants of the Free Syrian Army, which is something that we were all
big fans of.
Sort of told to we were all sort of told to honor and be impressed by the Free Syrian Army in sort of 2011, 2012 or thereabouts. And then it became clear that these guys were kind of useless or jihadists, or were just sort of getting out of the way and allowing jihadists to do the fighting and doing the administering of territory. So it's not a particularly serious group of folks. These are the folks that Turkey is working through are the remnants of the Syrian rebellion, and they do have a say in how these territories are administered. And that's very important to Turkey's justification. It is distinct from Russia's invasion of Ukraine. They're not claiming to take this territory. They're not claiming to take over.
They're not teaching their language in schools. They're not tearing down flags.
I'm not entirely certain about, well, they're certainly tearing down Kurdish flags. I don't know enough about the detail of how things are working. I think it's important to be aware, though, that the Turks are very interested in selling a story that these territories are more administered by Syrians than they actually are. The military force that shores up these territories is Turkish. The funding, the humanitarian NGO funding that is probably doing most of the social service provision and governing in this territory is largely Turkish. So I think I haven't been on the ground in these territories. I think they're probably doing a lot to maintain the fiction that this is not a Turkish occupation, but I think in practice, it probably is exactly that. And I was just reading a long history of Israel's failed occupation of Lebanon, and it's interesting. It always happens when you've got a vastly more powerful outside force working through locals that start out with some legitimacy, is that the locals lose that legitimacy just in day by day, month by month development of an occupation. The actors that have some independence lose that independence to the choices of the occupier. It's not a new story. And I think it's what's going on in northern Syria right now.
You were saying that these are very populated areas.
Well, that's what a report I read yesterday quoted the figure of 4 million people in Turkish-occupied Syria, and that really strikes me as too high. That's a lot of people in...
It maybe was pre-war numbers.
It's really hard to tell, Rory. Like the numbers are all estimates at this point, and my understanding of those estimates is that Syria's population before the conflict was 20 million people. We've supposedly got 5 or 6 million who have left the country. So, and then 6 million more are internally displaced within Syria. So if there are 4 million people in that territory, then the Turks control, a third, a quarter or a third of the Syrian population in Syria. And that seems high to me, but I just don't know.
But even if it's not the current number, it shows that it has the potential for that, which I'm sure maybe many Turkish people might look forward to one day.
Oh yeah, they definitely want. It's sad to remember because when I moved to Turkey in 2011 at the beginning of the conflict, the Turkish government was very proud of how well they were treating and taking care of the Syrian refugees. And I think the Turkish public was as well. This was just an indication of what great humanitarians the Turks were in contrast to U.S. and European countries, and it was true. I read articles talking about how the Turkish camps were so much better than the UN camps, this, that, and the other thing. And then around 2013, and with increasing negativity in the ensuing years, the Turkish government started falling apart. And unfortunately, as the opportunities available to the Turkish public have diminished, one of the very common, very standard reactions is to start blaming the Syrian refugees. And to be fair, the Turks have taken an extraordinary amount of Syrian refugees. The EU, an incredibly wealthy organization or entity, absolutely lost its sanity for a period in 2015, 2016 or thereabouts, with electoral consequences we're still seeing today. The politics of Europe were completely deranged by, I think, 1.5 million refugees.
Yeah, something like that. Shamefully low.
Turkey itself took 4 million.
One of the factors for Britain or the United Kingdom leaving would have been the immigrant crisis, as it was referred to.
No question. Without the destruction of Syria and Libya, there would not have been a Brexit. Because the final result on Brexit was what, 1%? 1 or 2% leave one by?
Yes.
Yeah.
It was like 1 and a bit.
Yeah.
52%.
That is another cost of the Syrian war that the United States chose. But we're not doing that today. We're not going into the U.S. in Syria because it just makes me angry. And Rob angry doesn't make for good podcast. So let's just focus.
Especially since you had such a nice Thanksgiving.
Exactly. We're trying to be more positive about U.S. hegemony here now at the More Freedom Foundation. At least until I have a bigger audience and I can really, really, really bear down.
Tear into
Yeah,
them.
indeed, indeed. But hey, I like U.S. empire. I benefit from it. Syria is not a place where U.S. empire did good things, to put it
But
mildly.
would you say one of the worst things that's currently being implemented would be the American sanctions?
No question. No question. So there's sanctions are fairly straightforward. I'm almost never a fan of them, but if one country sanctions another, it means that this country decides that none of the people who are controlled by this country, none of their business people can do business with that other country. What the United States can do and nobody else can do is something called secondary sanctions. So when the United States sanctions certain countries, now with certain countries, we only just do sanctions. We say US folks can't work with them. But for a very small subset of countries, specifically Iran and now Syria, we do secondary sanctions, which says that nobody in the world is allowed to do any kind of business with this country that we're targeting, which is a much, much more extreme thing. In international law, I think if international law wasn't exclusively whatever the United States says it was, I think that this would be recognized as a blockade. This would be recognized as an act of war. It is an act of war. We are carrying out constant acts of war against Syria and Iran, but they can't do anything about it.
And Syria is currently needing a hell of a lot of food.
Absolutely, absolutely. And you can look at, I saw, this wasn't in a report, this was just, I believe, a UN commentator talking about how in the aftermath of the Russian intervention, when Assad was sort of established as the clear winner of the war, the number of people in Syria who needed food intervention from the United Nations went down. And then in 2020, it started shooting up again, well, in part because of COVID, of course, but also because the United States finally cranked down with full secondary sanctions on Syria. We essentially started starving the place to death. Now, there are humanitarian exemptions on these sanctions. The United Nations is allowed to continue feeding people. And supposedly, we have all kinds of exemptions in our secondary sanctions regime for food and medicine and what have you. But in practice, nobody wants to be under any kind of scrutiny from the US Treasury Department. So people just don't do that. People are just much less likely to sell food or medicine to Syria because it is the victim of these sanctions. So essentially, we lost in Syria. We did not get Assad kicked out the way we had worked so hard to do for a decade. So we decided to starve the country to death.
But this is something that reaches the entire country. Like Turkey really only has the ability to, let's say, worst case scenario, it'll take the whole border, expand it a bit, but these sanctions just wreck everybody.
Yeah, yeah, and they wreck the region. Jordan is incredibly shaky right now. Jordan, which is, I think, most would agree, is one of the U.S.'s best and most stable friends in the region, is looking real shaky because there's just been this war going on to their north. They share a border with Syria as well, and now that the war is over, the United States still won't let them have normal trade relations with a country on their border. It's all pretty grim.
Because there is the economic gravity, which sort of suggests you generally trade with your neighbours.
Yeah.
It's sort of why the likes of Australia, although culturally very close to Britain, would often trade to other Asian nations much more than it will trade to countries that it's culturally close to. But yeah, it would make absolute sense.
Yeah.
For Jordan to trade with its neighbor.
U.S. policy towards Syria is deeply malicious and just deeply nonsensical. But I don't think we should let Turkey off that easily. I mean, Turkey, despite their claims, is occupying the sovereign territory of a neighboring country. It's not as explicit or open as what Russia is doing to Ukraine, but it's still bad. And it is especially bad if it becomes permanent. And I think that is something, it's a pivotal year, actually. It's a pivotal year for Turkey's occupation of Syria.
If Erdogan wins this election, will he push forward?
That's a great question. Is exactly what I was going to ask. I mean, who knows? Maybe he'll decide, okay, I've got this. I'm not seeing the election for another 5 years. Maybe I can tell the refugee haters and the nationalists to go f themselves, and I'm pulling out myself. Who knows? That's possible. New people could come in power and take it out. But if we get to the end of 2023, no matter who's in power in Turkey, and the Turkish occupation at that point, rounds its seventh year and heads into its eighth, then I think we're going to be in a situation where we can start talking about a decades long Turkish occupation of Syria. And if that happens, then, it can be, I mean, I think technically the Golan Heights, which Syrian territory that Israel occupied in the 60s, I think a lot of people in the world, no longer the United States, maintain that territory is going back to Syria, but I don't think that's going to happen. That's certainly not going to happen in any of our lifetimes. And I think that there's a serious danger of that same thing happening in Turkey. So, because the physical fact of the occupation can exist longer than the initial reasons behind it. I think that there were actually people in Israel who seriously believed that they were occupying territories like the Golan Heights, West Bank, and Gaza exclusively in order to get a peace deal. There were probably, through the first half of the 70s, there were people in Israel who believed that. And now, we're already, into the first half in the 70s as far as the duration of the Turkish occupation of Syria. And especially if the political situation switches and the Turkish occupation continues, then it sort of becomes just a thing that might continue forever, because Turkey is a very nationalist country. And if your political opponents can depict you as somehow selling short the Turkish flag by giving up and abandoning this occupation, whether it's called an occupation or an annexation or just a humanitarian operation or what have you.
But it could be seen as the stepping stones for Ottoman Empire 2.0.
Certainly. And I think there's certainly people in Turkey who want that. I don't think anybody's talking about that too explicitly at this point.
Not this presidential campaign anyway.
Exactly. But sure, that's definitely the subtext. Turkey controlled, Russia's big grievance in Ukraine is that they controlled Ukraine up until the 1990s. Turkey controlled Syria up until the 1920s for 400 years before that. So yeah, it's worrisome. Are they going to invade tomorrow? Having looked into it, I feel like, and I spent some time researching this, and I kind of think it's less likely than some other folks think. It could just be negotiation, these threats towards Manbij and Tel Rifat that the Turkish government have been making since May and have been stepping up over the past couple of weeks. It could just be negotiation, but then, that's what I thought about Russia's threats to invade Ukraine, and I was wrong about that.
But I think that shows just how insane a campaign that was, or is, sadly. While I think Erdogan's a bit more plugged in.
Here's hoping, man.
Here's hoping, but we can just sit back and celebrate that America's made it to the knockout stages in the World Cup.
That's true. It's very exciting. We're calling that the Sweet 16 here because that's what we call it in our college basketball.
Okay.
That's what we call the knockout rounds.
And you did it by doing something you'd love to do in real life, destroying Iran.
Oh dear me. Well, I don't think the U.S. public wants to destroy Iran.
Oh, definitely. I'm sure just a small number of very powerful military contractors do.
I think that's the case.
And Bolton.
Oh God!
Did you see Bolton is in the UK trying to stoke up Brexit?
Really?
That's what he's doing now. He's not He's not in the White House. He was on some daytime TV basically saying, oh, yes, you could never go back. It's so much better, isn't it?
That guy's such a uniquely malign actor. It's really extraordinary. It's just a sign that it's so a larger question, but it's just there's a premium put by certain very wealthy, very stupid people on the most aggressive U.S. policy imaginable. And John Bolton has been screwing the world up. I mean, I think it's fair to describe him as the father of the North Korean nuclear program.
Wow.
And he may end up being the father of the Iranian nuclear weapons program as well. Yet he is somehow still invited onto television programs to opine on foreign affairs, mostly because a lot of rich donors who know nothing about foreign policy believe that
That might know the Koch brothers.
yeah, might. I mean, it's not just the Koch brothers, and actually, the Koch brothers are well. The surviving Koch brother is surprisingly
Yeah.
peace oriented, actually. But
Oil's their big thing.
oil is definitely one of their big things. But yeah, John Bolton, man, pisses me off.
The More Freedom Foundation is also available on YouTube and TikTok. Rob's Twitter is RobO'Law, and he's also written a book called Avoiding the British Empire, What It Was and How the US Can Do Better. And music provided by Kevin MacLeod.
Complexity is the fact that adding to that fact is